Hey folks, Steve here with a very special review video for you today. We're going to be taking a look at Pitt's War, 1792 to 1815, Struggle for Europe. This is a magazine game that was published in Paper Wars issue 92 from 2019, so this is getting to be a little bit older these days. And the rules are contained within the magazine itself, though I have separately printed and replicated the content. There is a very nice guy who sort of reorganized the rules on Board Game Geek, and I have this printed out as a separate thing for just my play. So just keep that in mind if you see me handling that rule book. It's so that I wouldn't have to carry around the magazine, which I mean, you're still carrying around a book, but I could keep these things separate. So that's a personal change. So this is a magazine game designed by Stanislaus Thomas, and I'm sure I'm maybe going to struggle with that name as I usually do. This is a game on the Napoleonic period, and specifically including the overall revolutionary period, 1792. And this comes I believe this might be the latest game published by that designer. So this designer designed Napoleon Against Europe. He had also designed Nations in Arms, and this was sort of the most recent published game on the subject. And being a magazine game, it is adjusted to be a little faster playing. It's not as detailed as Nations in Arms, which is much more hex oriented, and you're really counting movement factors, and that becomes a really important part of the game. Here, we're talking about area movement. It probably looks a little similar to Napoleon Against Europe. But I would say this game, I'm going to talk about the way that the game works before I get to the later part of the video where I'll be on camera talking about my thoughts. But what I would say is important to keep in mind for this one is that it is a magazine game, okay? And now I believe, and we'll talk about this later in the video, that you could have certainly looked at this product as something to be printed and made a boxed version. And I think, in terms of the destiny of this game, there's a worthwhile path for it. But as a magazine game, it tries to condense the experience that you might get out of Nations in Arms or Napoleon Against Europe and fits it into this smaller format. So there are not cards, but there are chits that represent things like the Treaty of Tilsit, as one example here that you see. And I think probably just straight out of the gate, before we talk about the rules and how it works, I will mention straight up, I think this is the game where the designer got the ratios right in the what were cards in Nations in Arms, and there were cards in Napoleon Against Europe as well. I'm less familiar with that game, but part of the problem with Nations in Arms, it felt like, were that you had these important events that would come up, or maybe even important mechanics, and the cards would try to sit, in the mix of providing these special things that happen on the game map, particularly in the Revolution period, where a certain order of cards sort of matters on, like, the French Revolution getting its bonuses to various things. And at times, because you were dealing with a standard deck of cards combined with either the Revolutionary period cards or the Imperial period cards, you sometimes, based on how you're playing the game, might not see a certain card come out of the deck right away. And I don't think the number balance maybe was quite fit for that. If you were playing a multiplayer game up to 7 players, then the cards would maybe come out more frequently, and you would have a guarantee of seeing some of these important cards. So it was always a little weird trying to get that balance right. And I think Nations in Arms was fine, but that was definitely a part of that game system that had some challenges. Here, I think however you work out the numbers, this ended up executing much more exact to, you're going to see the important events. They're eventually going to come up. Very likely they're going to come up. And you have a little bit more levers to pull to try to get the thing that you want out of the deck of chits, or the pool of chits, the cup of chits. But each turn, there's actually a tempo that you follow on the turn track, which we'll take a look at, to where uh, the on a given turn, you might be drawing just two or three chits. On another turn, you might be pulling five chits, which means that, as you add in new chits and you take away chits, that balance of like what chits are available, what events are aging out, what events did you miss? It is possible for something to age out without you maybe getting to play it, which adds to the a little bit more to the unexpected nature of the game, a little more randomness, so you can't count on it. I feel like, and this is a pro for this game, I do think, however the numbers worked out, this was the right way to do it. And in fact, I, I would almost want to figure out a way to like retrofit this system back into Nations in Arms, because I think the numbers worked out right this time, to where like you're gonna see the important stuff. There is a possibility you might not see something, maybe, but you're not as worried about, oh, is that card going to come out of the deck in such a way? And specifically, what helps with this is that the French side and the coalition side have separate chit pools. So it's not just a deck and each player is drawing cards where you're going to pull a card that would be good for your opponent, but you're never going to play it, or maybe it gets played via some other mechanism. Here, like, if it's something that's going to help the coalition, it will probably eventually show up. There's a possibility it won't, just due to the other chits. And I just think it worked out better in this game. I think this is the right fit. It makes me wonder, like with the new version of War and Peace that just came out that includes some cards, will those cards have the right ratio fit to where the game experience will feel right? I don't know. But Stanislaw got it right here, and I think that's really important to point out. I think that added a lot to the game experience, where that like these chits were going to come. You had to think about how you were going to use them and how they affected the overall Napoleonic narrative, and helped to provide some skeletal structure to that experience. And I will say, I think it succeeded pretty reasonably well here, and that's a goodness. That's a good thing straight out of the gate. Now let's talk about what the gameplay really actually is, which is that you have forces on the map. This is an example of a relatively weak French force. It has two steps. That's the two in the middle. It's a combat bonus at the front and a movement bonus on the right side here. And this chit actually looks very similar to the types of chits you would see in Nations in Arms. And on the back side, we would see, indeed, this is the single step version. It doesn't have it loses its combat modifier. It retains its movement modifier. So what is nice about this kind of chit system, and I do prefer this to say something like War and Peace, is that a unit, like there is a differential of units. There are good units versus less good units, and you might be a victim of circumstance in a given fight based on what units you actually have. So by comparison, here's the Army of Italy. It has three steps. The C denotes that it has cavalry capability, which is important for cavalry superiority. Much better unit. And when you knock it down, it goes down to two steps. And if you knock it down again, there is actually a separate chit counter that represents the single step of the Army of Italy. It has a slightly different name, but on the back it tells you it's part of the Army of Italy. So your management of your forces on the map is a big deal. You also have leaders, and I mean we'll show Napoleon because he is just amongst the best in the game. He has a bonus. That +2 at the top is a movement and command bonus. So movement, and we'll talk about how movement works, but that adds to the movement die roll. It also affects things like interception and retreat before combat. Leaders add the C cavalry step, so he counts as a cavalry step when doing that comparison. That becomes important. And then his combat bonus, which are the die roll modifiers for combat, he has a +2 on attack, a +2 on defense. That's really quite good. So you have Napoleon obviously being amongst the best on the map. In terms of stacking, you have general stacking is up to 3 steps. If you have a leader, that adds 3 more steps, and then if you have another leader, that adds another 3 steps, and so on. There is a limit to the number of leaders. And if you're going to have a multinational force, you need to make sure that if you have, say, like a French leader, at least 50% of the stack in any given spot on the map here is French steps. This could actually be a problem for the coalition because oftentimes you will want to be combining, say, Prussians and Russians or Austrians and Russians. But if your leaders have kind of you have too many Prussian steps and not enough Russian steps, you're actually going to have a hard time stacking, and that comes into the gameplay in interesting ways. So that's mostly what you're going to be dealing with on the map, right? These are the combat units. There are control markers. You will find that there's probably not enough control markers in the game, and you're going to want to use the backs of used event chits as placeholder control markers. They actually work pretty well for that. So the game is complete in that respect, that you can get through the game. There are a number of minor countries. So let's say Napoleon liberates the Duchy of Warsaw. Well, you're going to get Polish units, and this happens to be a two-step Polish unit. So stuff like that will be throughout the game. The general function of the game really is at the beginning of every 3-year period, you're going to modify what event chits are in the cup, and they have years denoted. Please be aware that a lot of the 1813 chits are not labeled correctly, and you're going to need to modify them with a pen. I probably have a good example of one that I can show here somewhere. I thought I did. Maybe I don't. Oh no, here they are. So you can see here I have had to update and scratch out the 10 and put a 13. So, oops, that particular example, Lancers here, is not an 1813 or an 1810 chit. It's actually an 1813 chit. So easy to fix, but be aware that there is a little bit of errata there. And you can tell just by looking in the actual rules for the chits. Each chit gets an explanation in the rules. So you're never left wondering too much like, well, what does that chit do? You see it, you'll look it up in the rule book, and just so you can see what this looks like in the magazine, like these are what you're looking at. So 1804, what does a flank attack do? Well, they're combat chits in red, at large ones that are black, so you can kind of play them whenever. Blue ones have to do with possible naval invasions. Green are used for reinforcements or affect the reinforcement phase, that sort of thing. Or are potentially, the black ones also tend to be diplomacy chits. So the way it works, you're going to pull those by the yearly basis, or you'll remove them when they've aged out, and you'll restock the cup. And then according to the actual turn track, which I'll show here, and we'll see if we can get this zoom on reasonably well. It will tell you here in this column how many to draw that turn. It will also tell you what other special events may apply here, like in both the notes and in this third column, if there are leaders or new units coming into the force pools as reinforcements or leaving the game, or other things like in the Revolutionary period when the UK, Portugal, and so on join the war against the French Revolution. All that's handled on the turn track. I would definitely recommend, as you're going to play, to read that turn track and set up the units accordingly, because otherwise you might make the mistake of including some future reinforcement units in the like French force pool or Austrian force pool when they're not supposed to be there. And I made that mistake, I think, the first time I played this. The units themselves don't really indicate that. You need to check the turn track. So that'd be something, if this game were to be re-released, I'd probably want to add some helpful mnemonics for those things. But as you can imagine, once you're done with the event stuff, you draw your event chits, you have a diplomacy phase. Some of those chits just straight up tell you that you can bring a faction in, or you're going to get a die roll modifier to convince that power to join you, depending on who has the chit. Generally, you also have an option to spend some of your other chits that you happen to have that maybe you don't have a good use for them. You can spend them to get an attempt against a major or minor power, and spend additional chits to get bonuses you need to roll a 6 or higher on a d6, a 1d6, a single die. So it tends to be unlikely that you're going to convince a power to join you unless you are getting the benefits of multiple chits being expended, or you have a specific diplomacy chit that will truly shift it. Like there's the harem chit that supports the Ottomans joining France, and that provides a couple of bonuses to where you can build up, at least a 50% chance in that attempt or more to get that faction on your side. This is also important for the coalition and needing to make sure that they're always keeping some major power allied with Britain to fight France throughout the game. Obviously, that's a big part of the game flow. And again, the chits are set up to help give you the narrative as it played out historically. So the French player maybe is incentivized to play Tilsit to get Russia out. It does require that, France has defeated Prussia and Austria, and so it's just getting them to neutrality. But neutrality means that Britain can convince Russia to join the coalition again. So generally, that skeletal framework between the chits and diplomacy is there. And obviously, Britain can be working to convince minor countries like Denmark or Sweden to join the coalition as well. And they're going to tend to have a little bit more ability to kind of focus on that. Now, otherwise, you then also have, after you do diplomacy, there's a production step or a reinforcement step. So that's bringing in the units that are coming in off the turn track. But generally, what's included in the rules is a production chart telling you for each power how many steps they get. So you're basically just getting points to spend for steps. There are no naval units, so you're really focused. And in fact, this game really removes most of the naval aspect of things, which I didn't miss playing this as compared to Nations in Arms. Like it was fine to just accept that France is going to tend to have a harder time operating navally. But the production will then be like France is going to get 6 steps, or maybe 7 if they control Flanders, and they'll use those steps to improve. Let's say you have an army unit out in the field, it's at 2 steps. Well, so long as it's in supply, you can spend a step and bring it back up to full. Otherwise, you're going to be rebuilding units in France itself, 1 step per spend. And you're going to tend to want to focus on getting units fully built up to max because they're stronger than a bunch of single step units that don't have all the bonuses that you're going to want them to have. And then miners also can be built up. Now, it's going to very likely be that they get a single step. They can build a single step, and that's all you can expect from them. A couple of miners like Poland can use their abilities a little bit more frequently. And then some miners, and this is listed on the production chart, only get their reinforcement step at the start of a 3-year period. So these are countries like, I think, Switzerland is included in that. So there is a differentiation on the map of some miners are a little more productive than others. That's reflected in the production chart. And then the major powers really are relying on their star provinces to be able to produce. So it could be fighting Austria. If you've taken Vienna and Prague, but they've not surrendered, they may only be able to build with the Budapest stars and only get 2 steps. So the production model is simple. It makes sense. It does make you think about taking losses in combat to where you don't want units eliminated. You want to try to even out those steps so that if they make it to the end of the year, you're going to reproduce those steps back up. And that's how that gets handled for production. It's pretty easy. It's straightforward. I like that, at least. It was like very quick. You could get through production very, very fast. And then you have the actual operation activation phases. And the way that this works is each turn is a year, and a year is broken up into a good weather half and a bad weather half. And you can imagine the good weather half is effectively spring and summer. The bad weather is fall and winter. That's the easiest way to think about that. And so in each of those halves, you have a regular impulse phase where both players, this is a 2-player only game, are going to alternate activating a stack, taking actions, and then the other player goes until somebody passes, and then they're done, and the other player finishes up all the rest of their moves, which could be, pretty catastrophic if you don't have enough forces, that are if you pass too early, that could be a problem. And then immediately following that, stacks that have a leader involved, and however many leaders you have, can opt to move again. The stack has to suffer an attrition roll, and there is an attrition table to cover this that has a variety of modifiers that are sensical. And then they get to move again. And so this is where you get the case where Napoleon can do a lot more on the map in a single turn than most other leaders, especially if you're willing to accept some attrition. Now, that attrition, there are some event chits that modify attrition or force attrition. Attrition is worse in the bad weather half of a turn. Being out of supply makes it worse. You can do a force march and get bonuses to your movement die roll, but you're going to incur attrition with a bonus there. French or Russian units have some attrition benefits. They can avoid some. And then if you're only moving through friendly zones, you can also knock off a modifier on your attrition die roll. So the results of that attrition die roll can cause a step loss. It can also cause you to roll worse that movement at activation on any combat you're involved in. So attrition is a concern. It does factor in the game. So you do have to keep that in mind. But when you actually go to move, what you're doing is you're rolling a die and then you're adding modifiers for movement. So you add the leader's activation bonus. You also can use a unit in that stack's movement bonus to get a higher lower die roll. You do need to look at the chart for that. Now, these are all in the rule book of the magazine, just so you can see. So if I can get this, see if I can get this in front of you here. So you have things like this is the attrition table. There is some errata. I made this mark in my book where that needs to be a D, not a, whatever else that was, a 1. And then recruit points, and then you have the movement allowance. You can see here, these are some of the movement allowance modifiers. Key thing is, if you roll high enough, you can get up to like 6 or 7 movement points. How you use the movement points is pretty straightforward, as you might expect. That you're going to move, 1, 2 across a pass is 2, so 3, 4 to get here, right? Easy peasy. You also need to spend a movement point if you want to take control of a space that has a city in it or some other place of interest. That costs an extra movement point if you're going to leave that hex. So if I were here and I wanted to fight the Spanish in Barcelona here, this coastal army would go from here 1, 2, 3, 4 to take control of Girona and maintain our supply line, and then 5 to move into this hex for combat, or not hex, but location. And then if you win a combat here, you automatically take control of that space, which is helpful. And if we had any movement points left, unlikely given this stack doesn't have a leader, we could in theory move again. Moving across a river is 2, so rivers do actually tend to be the speed bumps for forces moving around the map. It is harder to maneuver around those rivers as you go. When you think about it, the maximum any stack, maybe with Napoleon or Suvorov, Russian leader Suvorov, could move is hypothetically 14 movement points, which is quite a lot on this map, and matters when you're out in Eastern or Central Europe, and there's just a lot going on, a lot of maneuvers. You can take a good leader like Napoleon, and with 7 movement points, so long as you don't lose a combat, you can keep moving after victory. You can reduce armies to nothing by beating them, chasing them down, and beating them again. So movement feels right in the bad weather half of the turn. That malice does mean you have a slower tempo. And I should say 14 movement in a turn half, not a whole turn. In the bad weather, you could, in theory, move 14 more, but due to the malices, you're more likely going to move maximum like 10. So the bad weather turn, attrition is worse. Movement rolls are also worse in the bad weather. So the tempo of operations does slow down, and you're going to deal with that. And in some cases, your smaller stacks, especially those without leaders, may not really move at all, or they're going to roll so low that they might only get 2 movement points, and there's really nothing of value to do with 2 movement points. So you simply say, I'm okay, they didn't roll high enough, I'm just going to leave them here. and that's their activation. So that uncertainty on just how big a move is that unit going to get can leave some forces where like, oh man, I really wanted to get out of there. I can't get away. Oh no, they're going to activate their stack and chase me and crush me. That uncertainty is helpful in the game, even in solitaire, because you just don't know, can you do the thing you want to do with the force? You're going to take attrition. Are you going to push that? Like there are decent decisions, even on a simplified map that uses area movement and relatively broad areas of movement at that. Like there are still plenty of good decisions to be made on how you want to deal with it. Now, on the map, there are uh, areas like marshes that require just one to enter, but you have to stop moving. There are also fortresses that, you can enter like Mantua, but even if it's empty and it does confer defensive bonuses to a defender, you have to have enough movement points left over to spend to take control of it. It costs two. So like Mantua is actually kind of hard to get into unless you rolled really well and you started your activation adjacent in like Milan, for instance. And that's all appropriate. Like fortresses do matter. There's not many of them on the map, but for the ones that do exist, you do have to put some thought into the campaign around them, which for like a Northern Italy campaign, or if you're trying to besiege Gibraltar, like that matters. Now, the naval stuff matters here. It's relatively straightforward. There is actually a naval capacities chart. France really can't do much naval movement, but the UK, Turkey, Sweden, Russia, and Denmark all have some capabilities in certain sea areas. The way it works is if you activate a stack, they have to roll high enough that they have a non-starred movement number and at least two. So if you roll low enough, you get two, but it's starred, which means you can't use naval movement. That can be debilitating to the British if they can't move guys out of the United Kingdom. But generally, you're going to spend the two movement points to move to a friendly port area. And then if you have movement points left over, you can keep moving. If you actually want to land at an enemy controlled space, and this is probably one of the most important things here, you have to use some chit that is blue, and actually its descriptor, which Mutiny does not have this descriptor. The descriptor has to actually say that you can attempt an amphibious invasion. So there are things that you can do, like as the French knock out Naples, stick a unit here, and the British may never be able to cross over the strait even into Naples unless they do a naval invasion, which is really interesting and a challenge for the coalition player. If you manage to take control of Gibraltar and you manage to take control of all of Spain and Portugal, Britain can't get back in to the continent unless they use a chit that allows for an amphibious invasion. So those chits are pretty rare. They are very valuable. So the commitment to, yeah, we're going to try a naval invasion becomes really, really important. Napoleon is going to have very few opportunities to do any naval invasions. And in fact, I have found in the game rules there is no reason to invade and conquer the United Kingdom. It's not an auto victory. I kind of understand why maybe that was excluded from the game. Uh, so, it keeps you on the rails of history, I guess. But the French naval capacity is pretty limited. You have a couple of opportunities to make something happen. You can, if you plan really carefully from 1792 on, maybe find a way to conquer Britain, and that will have game effects, but it's not an auto victory thing. So that's all movement, naval stuff. How does combat actually work? Well, combat's pretty straightforward. Once you enter into a space, your enemy does have the possibility to try to escape and avoid combat. They need to roll a die. Terrain will matter, and their leader bonus, if they have one, will matter, and you need to roll a 5 or a 6. So there's a decent chance to succeed, and you can move away, and ideally maybe you should be doing that a lot in the face of an enemy like Napoleon, but if he has enough movement points, he's going to continue to chase you. If you are going to stay in the spot, you have the option to play some of these chits that may give you bonuses in combat, but then you're going to make a ratio comparison that will give the benefit maybe to the attacker, like 3-to-1 odds is a +2, 2-to-1 odds is a +1. You do generally round up. You're also going to add your leader's battle bonus. You're going to choose a front or lead unit, and their combat bonus will be applied. Cavalry superiority will matter. If you have more C's on your counters involved in the combat, you will get a +1. Terrain might matter, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, both sides are going to roll a die, and that will indicate the highest roller will win generally. And the combat chart will tell you if you're going to take a step or you need to roll another die to see if you actually do a step. And what it'll say is like DR4 or DR2. That means if you roll a die and get at least a 2, you're going to do that extra step loss. So when we look at these things here, bigger battles where both sides have at least 5 steps and have 11 or more get bloodier results. But here, the best you can get is 2 steps eliminated against your opponent. Then you roll a die, and if you roll a 5 or a 6, you do a third step. So you can certainly wind up in interesting situations where, like, you won the battle, but your opponent maybe happen to do more step losses to you. So the defender will win on ties. So there is some nice variation in, like, what are the combat results that we're actually going to get. If you had cavalry superiority at the end of a combat, you will, if you had it at the beginning and you retained it through the end, you will get a pursuit die roll, which is really straightforward. If you roll high enough, you're either going to force your opponent to retreat an extra space. This actually might be helpful to them. Or you can do extra step losses. And again, when you think about the size of these units being armies, getting that extra step loss is actually super duper important. And then a 5-to-1 advantage can lead to that stack being eliminated. So you think about, maybe Napoleon on the rampage defeats an opponent, they retreat. You did decently well. You removed more steps. You hit them again, and you do it again, and you pursuit, and you do even more damage. And then finally, maybe they just have a single step left, and if Napoleon has enough movement points, he just overruns them and eliminates them, and that can be obviously catastrophic on the game map. So the combat system I generally like. It works. It does feel very similar to the Nations in Arms system, just a little bit different, a little more straightforward. There are some chits in the Coalition Cup and some other events that allow you to target and remove some French leaders. So while there's not the nuance and intense management of leaders that Nations in Arms has, which I thought was very interesting, here it's much more simple. And I guess the benefit of it is you're fiddling with less counters overall, and that's helpful. Now, you play through that, you play through your bad weather turn, and then at the end, you're going to count up some things. But importantly, you're also going to check for conquering a minor country. So for a minor country, let's use Naples as the special example, you have to control every location that has a point of interest. So you have to control Naples. You also need to control Palermo. And unfortunately, France is going to have a hard time getting over to Sicily. So you'll often find the case that France has occupied Naples and has control of it and is sitting here, and Naples is never truly conquered, so never joins the French side. But if you control all the locations for that minor, Tuscany is just one. Lombardy might require both Milan and Mantua. If you are conquering those minor countries, you will bring them over to your side. So they'll start to be able to be reproduced. They're minor power units on the map under your control, and you can retain control of the minor countries. For a major country like Prussia and Austria, Russia, and so on, you need to control their capital, and then that forces them to roll a surrender die. The more of their keys you control, like for Austria, we have Vienna, Prague, and Budapest. If you control all of the keys, they're guaranteed to surrender. If they have a couple of those key stars left, they have to roll higher than the number of key stars they still control to surrender. And so there's a possibility that a faction could hold out if they retain control of at least one of their key star provinces. But you can imagine, that Prussia may fall very quickly if they get trounced, or Austria for that matter, if you manage to control all of these key areas. Russia is much harder because their keys are very spread out, and Moscow is very far away, as you can imagine, in the Russian territory. Uh, but in the case where they surrender, they're going to be in a mandatory peace for basically a 1d3 circumstance. So either 1 turn, 2 turns, or 3 turns. At the end of that mandatory peace, they can come back into the game on the coalition side or whatever side they were on. Again, those chits are going to change the math of who's, or not the math, but the situation of who is where. So you have to deal with that. And then if a particular country is conquered a second time, or is conquered with the addition or utilization of a particular event chit, and this is how Prussia goes into this situation despite only being conquered once, where Austria, historically was conquered twice in game terms. Then that faction will have its mandatory peace, which will be followed up with a mandatory alliance, where you will now take control of that major power, but they'll have reduced production capabilities and a lot of other constraints on them. And there are specific event chits that will help the coalition bring Prussia and Austria out of their mandatory alliances and back into the coalition. So again, there is this kind of framework where the event chits are going to manage whether or not these historical things like the German War of Liberation will take place. It all works pretty well there, and generally you're going to follow history except where one faction is going to gain a distinct advantage. So if during the Revolutionary period, and this might just be a challenge in being the only game of note in the Napoleonic game world that gives you a full 1792 to 1815 experience, you can have some wacky stuff occur. Like, not only does France defeat its conventional opponents in Austria, but maybe continues to fight with Russia and even tries to conquer Russia. And if they succeed in doing that, that could mean that later, in the 1800s, if they conquer Russia, Russia becomes a mandatory ally of France. It really depends on if France outperforms early in the Revolutionary period, and playing all the way from 1792 to 1815 gives and probably benefits France the most in terms of giving them these opportunities to really like invest in conquering countries. So like we would say in terms of for Austria that like they didn't really conquer Austria, but they forced them to sign a peace deal. And there's like Campo Formio event chits that help govern that, but unless you really push, you could conquer Austria in the 1700s and then conquer Austria again pretty early on and bring in a mandatory alliance situation much earlier than historical. And I suspect maybe what should be in the game but is not is that the Peace of Amiens chit, which helps the transition from the Revolutionary period to the Imperial period in this game, probably should have included some kind of line that said that like you restart the conquered major countries counts for each major country so that that can't happen. But I guess it's an incentive in the game that it can happen. So I don't know what to think there. Maybe the designer's intent is to allow those like extreme circumstances, and it might mean that your 1792 to 1815 campaign will end early because you're going to say, hey, you know what, France has overperformed so well that there's not much worth in playing. Now, I played this quite a bit in terms of the Revolutionary period as well as the Imperial period. I would say that both are fine and dandy, but if you're going to play the full meal deal, do expect that things could go way off the rails because you just have that much more playtime for things to be different. I suspect this is why most other games don't even try to make it one big campaign, that like too much weird stuff happens where you have to say the Revolutionary period has a bookend and then the Imperial period has to pick up separately. Still, I think it's a worthwhile game experience. You should definitely try the full 1792 to 1815 scenario, just up and up. But the 1792 period by itself, interesting and fun to play. And I did find my last playthrough, 1805 to 1815, did kind of go along lines that I expected for like, does this feel like the Napoleonic period? It absolutely did. Um, Despite Napoleon overachieving. I will say I do wonder if the game is slightly balanced in France's favor, but if you watch my previous video on the 1805 campaign, I think I am better attuned to the French play style, and I've been not playing the coalition as well as I should have been, making some poor choices along the way. So my statement on that is possibly balanced in favor of the French by a little bit, but if you can get your head wrapped around the coalition play, that probably fixes itself and it might not actually be imbalanced at all. Um, so that's how the game works, guys. That's a lot to say. 40 minutes talking about the way that the game works. Um, I think for a magazine game, there is a lot to chew on here, actually. And I'll say, like, there's it definitely feels like it's bursting at the seams of being a magazine game. And we'll talk about that more here in my final thoughts. But let's switch over to that here. Okay, so for this one, guys, in terms of final thoughts, what I think of this, absolutely, probably one of the better Napoleonic games to just play in a small format. Um, Given it's a magazine game, you kind of come in with lower expectations for whatever reason. Like, oh, it's a magazine game, so they're going to be limited on, development time. And I think that factors into this a little bit. It's also going to be, I'm going to say it's going to tend to be cheaper, right? You're just buying the magazine. You also get a magazine, which if you're not familiar with Paper Wars, like there's plenty in here to read and enjoy otherwise as a magazine. So you get your money's worth. So price point, and I believe that this issue of Paper Wars you can still purchase today from Compass, is a fine value. So like just buying a game and or buying a magazine that comes with a game, you're the price point, what you're getting into. And so the question of like, is this a magazine game worth your attention? I'm going to say absolutely yes. I think this is a really good Napoleonic game, honestly. Now, is it as in depth as say War and Peace? Maybe, maybe not. Is it as in depth as Nations in Arms? Certainly not. But it does provide a really good Napoleonic period. Now, it's not multiplayer, so if you're looking for a multiplayer game, you're still better off maybe looking at Nations in Arms, War and Peace, Nations in Arms, that sort of thing. But if you can do a two-player or you're going to play the solitaire, I think this is actually a pretty good play. It sets up reasonably easy. There's not that many counters. Again, this is a magazine game, but you still get a really good feel for the Napoleonic period, and I like that there's unit differentiation. We're not dealing with just arbitrary strength points. And the event chits help keep the game flowing in, a designed flow of the time period and the political elements and diplomatic elements that affected the time period. So I think that it succeeds in very, very well. Now, in general, I'm going to say it was fun. It plays reasonably well. There are some cons. To put it this way, I would say like Pitt's War inherits the goodness of Nations in Arms in its magazine format. It also inherits some of Nations in Arms' problems, which is the rules could be tighter. There are instances where you're going to read the rule and you're going to have to like, okay, I think this is really what it means, or boy, I wish this event chit had just like a couple extra words to it that would resolve some confusion I have on whether it applies this way, or I think there should be this limitation, or clearly it means 4 steps or less, but it just says 4 steps. So you might have to say, well, it's not 4 steps, this stack, but it's 3 steps. And, I think it's no more than 4 steps. So, it doesn't say that. So there's a little bit of like, you still have to have a critical eye on the rules and what they are trying to say. Some of that could be translation. Some of that could just be it's a magazine game that doesn't get quite the same amount of development as, say, a box game probably does. So I think you can look past that. Like these are not issues that keep the game from being a worthwhile experience. I think these are things that are surmountable, certainly, for the gameplay that you're going to get from this and enjoy it. if I were to like have a wish for this game, I do think that this game is probably among the best from the designer, like it out of even nations. So just like what it's delivering hits the mark really well. I think this game probably deserves a boxed version where you get like a rule book, dedicated rule book. You get a dedicated like playbook, or maybe you combine it and just have it as one rule book with the scenario stuff and the event shits on the end. But like you could definitely deluxeify this game experience. So a box game. Maybe you turn the chits into cards. I don't know, but you keep the math the same on how many cards you get on a given turn and what the pool of cards is. But you could spruce that up with cards. And then I don't care if you make it a mounted map or not. I think the map actually works just fine. But the rules need some extra development. Same thing could have been said about Nations in Arms. But I think this one, there's less work that has to be put into it to really make it what it needs to be. So again, I would love this game to get a deluxe treatment. A box, cards or not, that's not a big deal. But just another opportunity for some development to refine the verbiage in the rules, make sure that it's sensical in English in all cases, and generally it is, but tightening things up a little bit would go a lot to helping the game, um, as well as what those cards or chit descriptions actually say. Now I've spruced things up with like printed out player cards and all that. That could all be extra fun stuff you could put in the box. I was willing to go the extra mile and print some extra stuff out to help my game experience with this one, but I truly think this game probably deserves a box treatment and one that just a little bit more love and care, and this game would probably sit stellar among all the other Napoleonic games out there. Just happens to be that as a magazine game, like it is a worthwhile experience. So we probably are not going to get that deluxe box treatment. So I would say if this interests you, like definitely go order the magazine and game and enjoy this game for what it is. I mean, I think it's a very fun Napoleonic experience. You get the Revolutionary period that you can play by itself. You get the Imperial period you can play by itself. And if you were really hankering for the full 1792 to 1815 thing, I think this is the only game that does it, honestly. I can give praise to Nations in Arms for having a really well fleshed out Revolutionary period set of scenarios. War and Peace, the new version has some. I think it is lacking a lot of polish, unfortunately. And that might be its own video we need to have. But this is giving you that. I think it is the only game that bothers to try, and it does a pretty good job of it within its magazine format, within the not terribly as in-depth as other systems, but it works. It works pretty well, and it's worth a play, in my opinion. So, as it relates to Pitt's War, in Paper Wars, issue 92, from Stanislaus Thomas, I hope I'm getting that name right, this is a thumbs up from me. I think this is a lot of fun. I think it's a really interesting game. You could play it with somebody who's maybe not super used to war games and still have a pretty good time. It's worth a look. And I've been playing a lot of Napoleonic games over the years, and whether you're playing something tactical or operational, I always enjoy a good strategic level game, and this one just hit the mark for me really, really well. I really like Nations in Arms. I felt like there's a lot to enjoy in that system, but it had a lot of, its rules issues were going to be a really big inhibitor. I think the rules issues for what exists for this game are really minor in comparison, and I think folks can get over them much more easily. Like, there's not really errors so much as I just wish it was tighter. You can get over that. This is great. Really, really recommend it. I'm really glad I have my copy. So while I think it's still in stock from Compass Games, I do recommend you give it a look and give it a shot, and go from there. So yeah, guys, there you go. That is Pitt's War. It's taken me a little while to get to this review. I'm really glad that I'm able to do it. This is worth your time. It was certainly worth my time for what I've invested into it. I'm glad that I actually took the time to play it and played it through a couple of times to get to where I am now with it. So thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. Hope it gets you a little more understanding of the game in general. You can always watch my playthrough videos. Those aren't for everybody, I know. But this review hopefully explained enough of the game that you have a sense of how it all works, and you can give it a shot. So, yeah, that's it for this one, guys. Take care, keep gaming. We'll see you in the next one.